Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Doctor's Eyes Only podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Oshman, and today we are going to talk about understanding how credit scores work for doctors and some of the things that you can be mindful of as you are taking out credit. So, this may seem like kind of an elementary topic. This is one of those kind of basic finance topics. But what I find in lots of conversations with physicians is that there are actually components of a credit score that physicians don't understand. And so, when you're trying to make decisions like, should I close my first ever credit card that I got that has a really low limit? Doesn't really make sense for me in terms of the perks that I want now. Should I keep it? Should I close it? Right? There is kind of the convenience answer to that question. And then there's the answer to that question if you're thinking about your credit score. Things like, do I need to be concerned about applying for another credit card? I already have a couple of credit cards that I use. Do I need to be concerned about applying for another credit card because I want the welcome offer or I want the points that it will get me? In thinking about how that's going to impact my credit score. So I thought it might be helpful today if we just talk through what are those components that go into a credit score? How can you use that as kind of a filter for decision making when it comes to taking out credit? The thing that I think is important to keep in mind about credit that can actually help you answer some of these questions or think through some of these things for yourself is that credit, in terms of credit score, is actually kind of counterintuitive. What do I mean by that? You would think that the people that had the highest credit scores were people that actually didn't use that much credit, right? They didn't finance things. They usually paid cash. They didn't carry balances on their credit cards. Like if I was lending out money, I would say, yeah, you're a great bet, right? You don't actually owe anyone anything. I would be more willing to lend you money, right? Or extend credit to you if I were a credit card company. What credit card companies want to see, what banks who are issuing loans want to see, is actually that you are a responsible user of credit. What that means is sometimes the more credit you have, as long as you're managing it responsibly, the higher your credit score can be. So just keep that in mind as we're going through is a lot of these answers are kind of counterintuitive, but once you get your head around that, then I think you can kind of follow how these lenders and credit issuers are thinking and you can kind of understand how it works. What should be a doctor's goal or really any consumer's goal in terms of the credit score that they should look to maintain? I will have people come to me, they'll be super proud. They'll be like, I have an 800 plus credit score. Normally, I tell doctors to aim to have a 720 or higher credit score because that's usually when you apply for credit, that's what's going to get you into the best interest rate category from a lender perspective. There are a lot of physician loans actually that will extend their best interest rate starting at like a 700 credit score. Student loans and things like that do play into credit. And so if you're in that 700 to 720 plus range in terms of credit, then you should be good in terms of having those best interest rates available to you. So if we're diving in, and I do have some notes here that I'll reference as we go, just so I can get all these percentages right. What are the elements that go into determining your credit score? There are actually 5 of them, and they all have a defined weighting. So if you're someone who tracks your credit score and kind of sees, oh, it went up, it went down a little bit, when you start to understand these factors and how they play in, then you could kind of see, oh, I bet I know why that happened. So the biggest determinant of your credit score, and I think this one is one that we could guess, is your payment history. This is why people say you want to make sure you make your payments on time. You want to make your payments in full. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to pay your credit cards off every single month. It does mean that you need to pay the minimum payment due, right? Same thing with your student loans, with your mortgage, with your car loans, with any other loans that you have. Make your payments on time, pay the full amount that is due. The easiest way to accomplish this, especially for busy doctors, is to set them up on autopay. So if you can go in, you can set them up on autopay. That is a great way to make sure that you don't miss any of those payments. I always suggest, especially for the first month or two that you've set up a new autopay, that you actually watch for it and make sure that it goes through as planned. Actually just had this happen to a physician client earlier this week. They had taken out a new loan. They had filled in everything to set up autopay. Somehow it didn't actually take in their system or it didn't process correctly. And so when the first loan due date came and we were watching for that, we saw that the payment didn't come out. In this case, we were actually able to call the lender. We were able to make what was technically a late payment But given the circumstances, given that it was some kind of system error, it was their very first payment, they didn't have a history of making late payments, the lender didn't charge a late fee and actually didn't count it as a late payment in terms of the credit bureaus. So I would suggest get those payments set up on auto pay, but then make sure that the first one actually goes through before you fully forget it. The second biggest determinant of your credit score, so this is actually 30% of your credit score, is something called credit utilization. And this is one of those things that I would put into that category of it's a little counterintuitive, okay? So this is like the amount of credit you use is 30% of your credit score. They want you to use some credit, but not too much credit. So it's 30% of your score, and they actually ideally want this to be less than 30%. What is credit utilization? It is the amount of credit you use divided by the amount of credit that's available to you. Okay, so that's your credit utilization. Let's make it simple. Let's say that I have $2,000 that I have spent on my credit card for the month, and I have a $10,000 limit. My credit utilization, I've spent $2,000, I have $10,000 available, my credit utilization is 20%. That's good in this context because they want it to be less than 30. That formula just compounds across all of the credit that's available to you, okay? So if you have 4 credit cards and they're each $10,000 limit, then you're dividing by 40,000. You're taking the amount of credit you've used on all those cards, you're dividing it by the total credit available, which is $40,000. And so that gives you your credit utilization ratio, which ideally is less than 30%. What are the implications of this if I'm thinking about trying to have a good credit score? If we go back to the beginning where I said, I get asked sometimes by doctors, they'll say, hey, I really want to get a travel card. Like I've seen online about this travel card. I've started to travel more. I really want to get this travel card. If I get that card, is that going to hurt my credit score? Well, let's think about credit utilization ratio. If I get a new credit card, if I keep all the cards I have, I don't change my spending patterns, I maybe just start doing some of my travel spending on this new card, all I've done is make that denominator bigger, right? So I've made more credit available to myself, which means I'm dividing by a bigger number, which means my credit utilization actually goes down. Now, some people will say, I pay my credit card off every month, so like my credit utilization is 0. They actually look at the total outstanding balance of whatever your statement cycle is. So they normally don't look at that 0 number if you pay your credit card off every month. They're actually looking at like when you get your statement, what are they saying you spent for the month? Here's a tip. Let's say it's holiday spending time. It's year-end charitable giving and you want to get some points, so you put those gifts on your credit card. And so you bump above that 30%, just pay it down before the statement cycle, like before they actually clock that number for your statement, and they'll never actually factor that into the equation. The third factor that goes into your credit score, this is 15%, is your length of credit history. So this is the amount of time that you have had your credit open. This is where that question of should I close my first ever credit card comes into play. Because the longer the credit history, remember, the credit score is supposed to be reflective of how responsible and experienced are you with using credit. So if I've been using credit since I was 15 years old, they see me as a better user of credit than if I've only been using credit since I was 30. That falls off of your credit report if you close out that card. What they're seeing is your active lines of credit. I think my first ever credit card had a $300 credit limit on it. I was just trying to get started and build my credit. To this day, I still have that credit card open. I have one recurring payment, like subscription payment that pays from that credit card, and I have it set up on auto pay. And the reason that I do that is because I know that that is the biggest positive impact to this 15% of my credit score. That is my length of credit history. It's a nuisance to have that really small, that small limit card that pays for exactly one thing every single month. I wish I didn't have it. I don't carry it around with me, so it's not at risk of getting taken or run up or anything like that. I do activate the new card every time they send it. I keep that on auto pay, and that's just to keep that credit history length really strong. Okay, so we've gone through the top 3 factors that impact your credit score. There are 2 left that add up to the final 20%. They each take 10%. So the first one is new credit inquiries. So this is where you will sometimes hear people caution you, and they'll be like, look, if you're shopping alone, right? Let's say you're going to buy a house, you're going to get a car, you're kind of shopping for interest rates. What you want to do is double check with those institutions or those lenders that you're shopping with and just say, hey, I don't want you to do a hard credit pull yet. They can either ask you like roughly what is your credit score? And if you know that from another source, you can share that with them. They can kind of work up what their offer would be. And then they just pull a hard credit to confirm, or they can do like a soft credit pull, which doesn't have quite as much impact. This isn't really something that you need to get super worked out of shape about. It's just something you need to be mindful of. So again, think about being a responsible user of credit. If you are out there actively on the market looking for credit, you've opened a new credit file with 10 different lenders and they've all just pulled your credit score, the credit bureaus are like, what is going on? Is this person about to go crazy with their credit? And so that does impact your score a little bit. It's temporary. That doesn't impact it forever. So you just want to be mindful if you are shopping for a loan and just try to either, like I said, get that generic information before you let them actually pull your credit. Just have the lender that you're actually going to go with pull the credit, the top 2, that kind of thing. Just be mindful of a bunch of credit checks all at one time because that can pull your credit score back temporarily. If you go back to kind of normal patterns and you're not really using credit on an ongoing basis, then it will come back up. But that's just something to be aware of. And then the final factor that goes into your credit score is what they call credit mix. I'm like a broken record at this point. Responsible user of credit, they want you to be experienced with different types of credit. So there are actually situations, if I have a physician who's maybe early on in their career who didn't establish credit when they were young, right? Maybe they were taught that credit was something you wanted to avoid, you wanted to pay with cash. I'm not anti that at all. But then at some point, you do have to start using some credit so that you can build a credit score, you can build a credit record, you can increase a credit score so that you can do things like get a mortgage at some point. So there may be situations where getting something like a car loan, even if it's temporary, right? Even if you get it for a little while and you pay it off, you get it until you get a mortgage. There are situations where it can make sense to finance something that maybe you otherwise could be in a position to pay cash for. And you can choose, right? With something like a car, you can choose how much you finance too. So if you're like, we're going to pay cash for the majority of it, but then we are going to finance a little bit because we want to hit that credit mix. That is the lowest determinant, the credit mix, the credit pulls, those are the lowest determinants of your score, but they are a factor. The thing that a lot of doctors have going for them, most doctors that we work with do have mortgages. So that is a type of credit. And then so many doctors have student loans. So if you ever get like frustrated, oh, I'm still paying on those student loans, maybe you can look for the silver lining and just say like, well, it's at least helpful for my credit score. You're making on-time payments on those every month. That does add to your credit mix because it's a different kind of credit than the other credit that you have. And so that actually does boost your credit score. And a lot of doctors just have that by default, right? Because you have to take out loans to be able to afford medical school. So those student loans actually are helpful in the grand scheme of things with your credit score. So if we're recapping the 5 things that determine your credit score, we talked about payment history, we talked about credit utilization, we talked about the length of your credit history, we talked about new credit inquiries, and then we talked about that overall credit mix. So if you're just being mindful of those things as you make decisions around credit, it doesn't take a lot of dicey math or rocket science or anything like that. It's really just being mindful of those things. And then as you have those questions about, should I get that new card? Should I close that old card? Should I finance this car? You can actually start to think about, well, not just what logistically makes sense for my life, for my financial picture, but how is that going to impact my credit? So the last thing that I thought I would touch on before we call it an episode for today is, how do you make sure that your credit stays in good order? And what I mean by that is, we've talked about this on the podcast before. I know I've talked about this on some of my Instagram videos. We've talked about this in webinars that we've done, and we can link to some of those things in the show notes. We've talked about the fact that if someone else gets a hold of your personal information, they could actually take out credit in your name, right? And if they do certain things like where the notifications don't come to you, you might not find out about that for a while, or you might not find out about that until you get a random statement that you're overdue on a credit card that you didn't even know you had. So, when we're thinking about being responsible with your credit score is part of it. And we talked about everything that goes into that. Making sure that your credit remains accurate and that you're on top of anything that maybe isn't you or could be fraudulent is also super important. So, there are two things that I would suggest that you do to be mindful of protecting your credit for the long term. The first one is to pull a credit report every year. There are three main credit bureaus: Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. You can pull your credit report from all three of those every year for free. And it's a best practice. I actually have a reminder on my calendar every year. I do this for me, I do this for my husband. I go to annualcreditreport.com, I pull our free credit reports, and I just look through and make sure that I know what all of those things are. Those of you who have been longtime listeners have probably heard the story. I pulled my husband's credit report and he owed a few $1,000s on a Best Buy credit card that I didn't know that he had. And I asked him about it. He said, I have never opened a Best Buy credit card. It turned out it was fraud. Someone had gotten a hold of his information. They had filled out the thing that you get in the mail or pick up in the store or whatever. They had opened a Best Buy credit card, bought a TV or something like that. There was interest accruing. We hadn't made payments. As soon as we saw that on the credit report, then we knew that we had to get to work and actually report that as fraud, get that taken off of the credit reports. It no longer shows up today. That's something that I don't know that we would have known about that had we not had that best practice to pull those annual credit reports. So that's something that I would suggest that you do. Pull it once a year. It does not take very long to just go through and just say, yep, that's my mortgage, that's my car loan, that's my student loan, those are my credit cards. Just make sure that you recognize everything that's on there. The second thing that you can do, and this is something that I did a while back, and it just gives me a lot of peace of mind. It is for myself, my husband, and my kids, was a credit freeze. So I mentioned those three credit bureaus. You can actually go to those websites, and we can link to these as well. And you can create a username and password, and then you can enact a credit freeze. What that means is that no one can request credit in your name without your knowledge because they would have to do a credit check, right? If you went to apply for a loan, if you went to apply for a credit card, they're going to need to reach out to the credit bureaus and get your credit score. They cannot do that without your permission. You'll get notified and then you'll actually have to log in and just unfreeze the credit. It's pretty easy. Just make sure that you've saved those logins and passwords, ideally in like a secure password manager, so that you can easily do that. But you can unfreeze it, let them take the credit pull, and then freeze it back. And that just gives you the peace of mind that no one can be accessing your credit or taking out credit in your name without you knowing about it or without your express permission. So I think that's a really good safeguard, especially in today's day and age. There have been so many security breaches. I think it's better to assume that someone out there has your personal information and could use it, and to protect yourself accordingly. That credit freeze is a great way to do that when it comes to protecting actually the integrity of your credit. So I think when we think about a topic like this, again, this seems elementary, but my guess is if you're listening today, you probably picked up one or two things that maybe you didn't know, or a couple of actions that you're going to take as a result of listening to this. Part of what we do at Vestia when it comes to financial planning is we're available to answer all of these little questions, right? So if you're like, hey, I want to get this new card, how is this going to impact my credit? Should I do it? Things like that. That's what we're available for. So if you don't have an advisor, if you don't have someone to kind of bounce these decisions off of, and you are intrigued by the idea of doing that, you can email us at myteam@vestia.com. Just let us know you listen to this podcast and you'd like to talk with one of our advisors. We'll get you in touch with one of them, talk to you a little bit about what's going on in your life and how we might be able to be of help and add value for you. We would love to do that. Thank you so much for listening. My name's Lauren Oshman. I am honored that you chose to spend some of your day with us here at the Doctor's Eyes Only podcast. Please do subscribe. We have lots more great content coming, and I don't want you to miss any of that. Until next time, have a great day. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Vestia Advisors LLC. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. It should not be construed as legal or tax advice and is not intended to replace the advice of a qualified attorney or tax advisor. This information is not an offer or a solicitation to buy or sell securities. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Before investing, you should consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses associated with investment products. Investment decisions should be based on an individual's own goals, time horizon, and tolerance for risk. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Diversification and asset allocation do not ensure a profit or guarantee against loss. Consult your financial professional before making any investments. Investment advisory services offered through Vestia Personal Wealth Advisors, Vestia Retirement Plan Consultants, and Vestia Advisors LLC. Securities offered through Osdale Financial Partners, Inc., 5187 Utica Ridge Road, Davenport, Iowa, 52807. Member, FINRA, SIPC. Vestia Personal Wealth Advisors, Vestia Retirement Plan Consultants, Vestia Advisors LLC, and Osdale Financial Partners, Inc. are independently owned and operated.